The NFL season is just a couple of days away, so in today's video, let's go ahead and rank every single NFL teams for my week 1 power rankings. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be ranking every single team from 32 to number 1. For each individual team, I'll be giving you guys a little bit of some analysis and reasoning as to why they are in that specific spot. And of course, there's going to be timestamps in the timeline, so if you guys want to skip to different teams, you can always use the timestamps. With that all said, if you do go on to enjoy today's video, hit the like and subscribe button, but let's get into the video. Coming in at number 32 is going to be the New York Giants. I love a lot of things about this team. I love Malik Nabers. I love their defensive line. I like their linebackers, some of their corners, and I do think the offensive line is relatively improved from last year. But the one thing holding me back about this team is going to be the quarterback situation. It's the thing that everyone's going to be talking about the entire season, and for good reason. Daniel Jones is not a good quarterback, and even if Daniel Jones were to get injured or to get benched, it isn't like Drew Lock is all that much better. Plus, I'm pretty sure he's dealing with an injury right now. And it also doesn't help that I'm just not the biggest believer in Devin Singletary, so you're going to have a bad passing game because of potentially Daniel Jones, and a running game that I don't think you can rely on like you were able to do with Saquon Barkley. With that being said, Malik Nabers will be an absolute stud this year, so maybe he can help out a guy like Daniel Jones to have a better season. But with that said, they're going to be my bottom of the barrel type of team. Then at number 31 is going to be the New England Patriots. Now, I do think the Giants are more talented than the Patriots, but I personally believe a lot more in Jacoby Brissett than I do in a guy like Daniel Jones. I just, at this stage, don't think Daniel Jones is a good quarterback. I know what he did a couple years ago, but that was a couple years ago. He's coming back from injuries. He did not look good in the preseason. Whereas, thus far, I think the Patriots have looked okay. At the quarterback position, if Jacoby Brissett doesn't work out, you obviously have Drake May, who's ready to play any given day. And I do think the team in general is actually pretty decent. I actually think they have a top 10 level defense. I just think the offense is really going to hold them back. They have question marks on the offensive line. The receiving core is not proven, and I just don't know how I feel about this run game being able to carry an offense with Jacoby Brissett leading the way. So with that being said, I think they'll be a decent team, but I don't think they're going to be anything special. They'll have a couple fun games throughout the season, though. Coming in at number 30 is going to be the Carolina Panthers. I feel as if a lot of people are going to put the Carolina Panthers in last place yet again, but I kind of do think that Bryce Young is going to have a much better season in 2024. Last year was absolutely embarrassing, but a lot of it was not his fault. He had the worst offensive line, a terrible run game, terrible coaching staff, and no receiving weapons to throw the ball to. And in this offseason, they brought in Dave Canales, who I absolutely love. They fixed up some positions on the offensive line, brought in Deontay, brought in Ja'Tavion Sanders, Jonathan Brooks, Xavier Legette, all these young guys, and I do think overall the offense will be better. And given the fact that the defense, in my opinion, is like top 15-ish, I think this team could be a slightly better team. That being said, they're not going to be contending for a playoff spot. They'll win 5, 6, 7 games at best. Then at number 29 is going to be the Denver Broncos. Now, when I'm doing a power ranking, I'm not necessarily predicting how many wins a team is going to get, because sometimes you can be a really bad team but end up with 7 or 8 wins, which in this case, I think Denver's probably going to find themselves in this year. Now, I will say this. I think Denver has the best chance of any of the teams I've talked about thus far to be a little bit higher than where I have them, because I think Bo Nix has looked very good throughout the preseason. It's just that I think the rest of the talent on that team doesn't match up with the rest of the teams I'm going to talk about later. I think the offense is missing a lot of key pieces. You don't really have a great receiving core. I'm very suspect about the run game, and I think the offensive line isn't that great. And yes, defensively, you're going to be a decent defensive team, but you're going to have to blitz to get a lot of pressure because you really don't have a dominant edge rusher on that team. Of course, you have Patrick Surtain and a bunch of other studs on that defense. I just don't know how I feel about that team yet. I believe in Sean Payton to get this team to 6, 7, 8 wins, but in terms of a power ranking video, I'm not going off of just wins. I'm going off of just how good I think that team is going to be in comparison to other teams. So I have them that low for that reason. Then at number 28, I have the Washington Commanders. I believe in Jayden Daniels a lot more than a lot of other people, but I still feel as if that team is going to really struggle this year for a number of reasons. For starters, this is a team that brought in a ton of new players like Bobby Wagner, Dorrance Armstrong, Frankie Louvu, Austin Eckler, obviously the quarterback, the head coach. Everything is basically brand new for this team. So you're kind of filling in a bunch of positions with a bunch of players from different situations. And obviously it's going to take a little bit of time to mesh and gel and grow that chemistry. And when you're talking about a quarterback who's as young as Jayden Daniels, obviously a rookie, it's definitely going to take a little bit of time to build that chemistry and gel. So I think this is going to be a team that starts off the year. Maybe a little bit slower. Again, if you watched my last video where I talked about my week 1 predictions, I do have Washington winning. But regardless, I still do believe that Washington will probably come out the gates through the first like 8 weeks, maybe like 2-6, 3-5, something along those lines. And then as the year goes on, they'll be better. But again, this for me does not come down to wins. It comes down to overall rosters and where I think you rank. And as of today, I just don't think Washington ranks that highly. But similar to Denver, I could definitely see a world where Washington were to maybe move up in the power rankings and potentially be like a low tier 9th or 10th seed. Then at number 27, I have the Arizona Cardinals. I am a lot higher on the Cardinals than I think a lot of people are, though I have seen a lot of people recently praise them for a lot of the moves they've made, and I do think that's the right idea. Kyler Murray, to me, is a very polished and good quarterback. I know he hasn't been able to prove it on the field the past couple years because of injury, but a healthy Kyler Murray with a good team around him is a very good quarterback, and I think because of that, I think that he can lead this team to a somewhat favorable record. Now, I don't want to predict them to make the playoffs because, quite frankly, I don't think they will. But with an improved offense with guys like Marvin Harrison Jr. and some development from their tight ends like McBride and then Michael Wilson, and I do think the defense will take a slight step forward, I think that will allow a team like Arizona to be a better team next year, but not necessarily by much. This was not a good team last year, though they were competitive, and I think this upcoming year they'll take a step forward while still remaining very competitive with basically everybody. Then at 26 is the New Orleans Saints. This is a very similar team to Denver where they're not a good team, but they have enough talent to find a way to get to like 7 to even 10 wins next year. With that said, though, I'm not basing this off of wins. I hope I kind of make that point very clear. I'm basing this on how good I think you are. I know wins are a very good tell sign of that, but in this situation, we all know the Saints aren't a great team, but they're good enough to be on that playoff bubble, which I think is where they're going to be at this year. I don't believe in Dennis Allen. I don't believe in Derek Carr. I think this team has a ton of issues, but there are some good players who are still playing at a very high level, such as a Chris Olave, and a number of other guys in this team and defense. I think this defense can be borderline top 10 next year. So with that said, they're going to be like good, but not great. And I don't know, very, very, very mid, I think is probably where they'll be at, to be honest with you. At number 25 is the Tennessee Titans. This is the hardest team in the entire video to rank because if Will Levis comes out and plays really good next year, this could be a borderline top 15-ish team. But if Will Levis doesn't play good and is either mid or bad, we're talking about a team that's probably lower in the ranks. So it's really hard to judge where this team is going to go. A lot of it just comes down to your personal interpretation of what you think of Will Levis. Now, for me, I think Will Levis is a good quarterback, but I haven't quite yet seen it on an NFL field, so it's really hard to talk about where they're going to be at without seeing a whole lot of Will Levis on the football field yet. But because I liked a lot of the moves they've made, I think the offensive line improved, I think the defense is pretty solid, and I think overall the team around Will Levis is really good. I could definitely see the potential for this Titans team to be very good. I know some Titans fans are not going to be happy about their placement, but it's really hard to judge how good this team is going to be because similar to Washington, you brought in a bunch of players from various different situations, so it's going to take time to gel and build chemistry while you're also developing a young quarterback like Will Levis. It just makes it very hard to predict where you're going to finish and how good your team is going to be. Number 24 is the Minnesota Vikings. I think the roster for the Vikings is really good. Now, it's not Super Bowl ready good, but it is like borderline playoff team good. The issue for this team is JJ McCarthy had a massive injury and he's out for the year, which is absolutely devastating because I thought he looked really good. Regardless, I do think Sam Darnold is a good enough, serviceable starter to get this team to like an 8-9 record, which I think is ultimately where they will find themselves. I believe in Kevin O'Connell. Obviously, you have Jefferson. I think the run game will be good with Aaron Jones, and I think defensively speaking, I like what they did last year, and I think they'll improve upon that. So with that said, I think Minnesota will be a okay team next year, but their ceiling is very limited, such as a lot of the teams I've already talked about thus far in the video. Coming in at number 23 is going to be my own Las Vegas Raiders. Now, if you did watch my week 1 predictions, I got a lot of flack from Raiders fans for having the Raiders lose week 1, and I feel like I'm going to get a lot of flack again for putting the Raiders at number 23 on this list. I love a lot of the pieces on this team. I think the offense should be just as good as they were last year, if not slightly better. I know you lost Josh Jacobs, but I do believe in Zamir White to fix a lot of the issues with the run game. And then you have to expect that the defense is going to take a step forward with all the additions you made, the big name obviously being Christian Wilkins, plus some continuity with your head coach. But my whole issue for this team is that I don't believe in Gardner Minshew, and I don't believe in Aiden O'Connell, And in a league where the quarterback is going to either make or break your team, I think it's ultimately going to break the Las Vegas Raiders. Again, I don't think the Raiders are going to be bad. I think they'll be a good team, a very competitive team, and a team that potentially, if everything does go right, could maybe slip into like the 8th or 7th seed, maybe making the playoffs, but I seriously do doubt it. Again, Raiders fans are going to absolutely drill me in the comment section below for actively saying that my favorite team is not going to be a good team, but I have to be realistic and I have to be honest with you guys. I can't have my bias be thrown in there and say, oh yeah, the Raiders are going to be the best team in the league, when that's just clearly not true. Their ceiling is very limited with Aidan O'Connell or Gardner Minshew. This to me is a bridge gap year where you're going to figure out a lot about your team, but you still got to find your franchise quarterback. And as of right now, I don't think they have that guy on this team, unfortunately. However, let's move on to 22, which is going to be the LA Chargers. And again, Raiders fans are going to drill me because that is the exact team that I have beating in week 1. I have the Raiders losing to LA. Again, check out that video if you haven't already. Make sure you finish this one first though. For LA, I think a lot of things are going your way. I still think this team is a little bit overrated in comparison to where a lot of people in the national media have them. A lot of national media members are saying, can LA Chargers make the playoffs? And to be honest with you, I don't think they will. But with that said, if Harbaugh works out and if Herbert has a healthy, successful year, this team can be really good next year. Now, they're still extremely limited with their talent that's on their team because their receiving core, let's just put it how it is not good. The offensive line should be a bright spot, but there's a bunch of question marks with the running back room. And defensively speaking, I don't know what you're going to get from a couple of those guys. Derwin James was coming off of a okay year last year. Khalil Mack played good, but Joey Bosa hasn't been able to stay healthy. And you're relying on a bunch of guys who are a little bit unproven and a little bit older. So it's just a defense that I don't really know how to feel about. So all in all, I think the Chargers will be better next year, but it's hard to guess if they're going to be really good or like mediocre, which I think is about their floor, which potentially could be better than a team like the Raiders, just being honest with you guys. Coming in at number 21 might be my biggest controversial pick of the entire video. I'm going to put the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think defensively speaking, they have a really good defense and one of the best in the league. The issue with this team is going to come down to that quarterback position as well as the overall offense. I just don't think this offense is going to be that good thus far through the preseason, and I know it's preseason, but I do think it's a bit indicative of how good your team could be when your starters are playing the majority of the game. But what we saw in the preseason was the quarterbacks looked terrible, the receivers weren't getting much separation, and the offensive line wasn't playing good at all. And that's a massive concern when all of those things were thought to be a better part from what they were last year. Now, with that said, it's just preseason and it was a small sample size that we're not going to be able to see until we actually get to the regular season. So let's hold off and not put too much judgment out there. But I'm still going to stick to my guns here. I don't think Arthur Smith is a good fit for this team. I don't love the situation with the receivers because I really only think you have George Pickens and like that's really it as like a really good receiver. I think you have a bunch of unproven guys or guys who have been in the league who haven't done much in a couple years, and then you're relying on some young offensive linemen that have a lot of issues still. Plus, you got Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, and I'm sorry, but yes, they're better than Kenny Pickett, but realistically, how much are they better than him? Like, Russell Wilson at this stage is not a good quarterback. He's a very mediocre to bad quarterback. Let's just put it how it is. And Justin Fields, thus far through his career, hasn't really panned out. It has not worked for him, and you're putting them in an Arthur Smith offense, and I just think this is a recipe for disaster. Now, with that said, I do think the defense can carry them to a bunch of different victories like they have been doing the past couple years, but I still feel as if this offense is going to be a massive issue and a weight on the back of the shoulders of their head coach, Mike Tomlin. This team could probably win like 10 games next year, but with the loaded AFC and their loaded division, it's going to be hard for Pittsburgh to be a good team next year with the quarterback situation they have going on. I'm just being honest. However, let's move on to number 20, the Chicago Bears. Offensively speaking, I think this team has a ton of potential, but it's just very unproven right now. You have Caleb Williams, who's a rookie, and he can either have a really good rookie season or a really bad rookie season, so it's really hard to tell with any rookie quarterback how good they're going to perform. But then you look at the rest of the offense, and yes, the offensive line has issues, but I think Caleb can work around them. Receiving core is stacked. The running backs look good. Cole Kmet at tight end, and I think the offensive coordinator will put them in the right situations. And defensively speaking, I think they have arguably a top 10 defense. I think they have arguably a top 10 defense, and I think by most accounts, most people would say they do have a top 10 defense. So assuming they can reach their potential and reach that peak, this team can be really awesome next year. But because there's so much unprovenness in the regular season with their offensive weapons, with their offensive key players, mainly Caleb Williams, it's really hard to put them anywhere higher than where I have them. This is a team, though, that if everything does click and does go their way, could easily fly up the board and be like a top 15 team. I think this team is really set up for success for the next like 8+ years. Coming in at number 19 is going to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think this team is really mediocre. I feel like a lot of Buccaneers fans are kind of rewriting history because they're like, oh, we had such an incredible year last year. But in reality, you went 9-8, and that's all you did. Yes, you beat Philadelphia in the playoffs. Congratulations, that was an absolutely thriller game in which you absolutely smoked the crap out of that team. But then you lost in the second round, and it was pretty clear that that was going to be your ceiling the entire season. And yes, in the offseason, you fixed one of your biggest issues, which was the interior offensive line, but how far is that realistically going to take you? This is essentially the exact same team, plus a couple pieces and minus a couple, but for the most part, it's the same core group of guys, and you're still rocking with Baker Mayfield. And given the fact that I think Atlanta is currently the best team in that division, best case scenario, at least if my predictions come true, you're going to be in the wild card, which is best case scenario. But I think realistically speaking, there's a legitimate chance that some other teams jump you and you don't make it into the playoffs, the wild card. Again, I feel like a lot of people have been rewriting history about this Buccaneers team by claiming they had this fantastic year in 2023. You guys went 9-8. Like, that's not good. That's very mediocre to mid. So because of that, I have your ranking kind of in the middle of the pack. I don't think this team has a very high ceiling. Like their ceiling is maybe 10, maybe 11 wins if everything goes good. But when you get to the playoffs, you're going to lose in either round 1 or round 2. Like, that's your ceiling. But your floor is like 7-10, which is still a good floor, but that's like your floor. So you're 7 to 11 wins, which is mediocre, let's be honest. Now, that comes off very negative about Tampa Bay, and I do apologize. I feel like I've been very negative on them, but I feel like I find myself defending myself from Buccaneers fans, but it's just how I think about them. With that said, a bit more on the positive side here. Mike Evans is an absolute stud. I think they have some really good pieces offensively, and I think defensive-wise, you got a lot of things going on. But again, you also had a lot of things going on last year that were good, and you still only won 9 games, so I kind of think you're going to have a pretty similar season, which, hey, maybe making the playoffs and being a second-round exit is good for you. That's cool for me. But at number 18, let's talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars. Of all the teams I've talked about, the Jaguars are a team that I have fluctuated the most on. I have had them as low as like in the 20s and as high as like top 10 because I think that thus far Trevor Lawrence has looked great in the preseason, but it's preseason and I've loved a lot of the moves they've made this offseason, and I think defensively they'll be better, but it's really hard for me to put them in that top 10. For now, I'm going to put them kind of in the middle of the pack. I think they can win upwards of like 12 games, but their like floor is like maybe 9 wins. So that kind of puts them similar to Tampa Bay. But because I believe in a lot of the pieces on this team, and I think they have a higher ceiling than most of the teams I've talked about in this video, that's why I had them at number 18. I think Trevor is going to be in for a really big breakout season, you could say, and I think a lot of the pieces are also due for a really good year as well. It's just going to be, can this team find the consistency for the entire year like they did a couple years ago? And I think if they can put themselves in the conversation to potentially win that division. I still think it's going to come down to Indianapolis versus Houston, but for the most part, I think Jacksonville can be in that conversation for most of the year. We'll see if they can make the wild card. Coming in at number 17 is going to be the Seattle Seahawks. I think this is a team that has a lot of good things going on for them, but a lot of question marks still need to be answered. The biggest question mark being, can this defense take a big enough step where this offense maybe doesn't have to carry them in a lot of games? Last year, this defense was pretty darn bad, but you brought in Byron Murphy, who I think has been awesome, and I think is going to be a fantastic player for that defense. And you brought in Mike McDonald. So if that defense can become a strength this year, I think this team could easily be top 10. But if it does take the defense some time to grow and develop, and maybe it takes a few years to get to being a good defense, I think this team is just going to be somewhat okay next year and very similar to what they were last year. Because offensively speaking, I don't expect a whole bunch to change. I think they're going to be better offensively speaking, but not by much. I still think Geno Smith is a good quarterback. Obviously, JSN, DK, Tyler, and I think most of your pieces on the offensive line are good enough to get the job done. But there's still a bunch of question marks that do have to be answered. I talked about the offensive line. That's a big question mark that also needs to be answered. You brought in some new pieces, but you lost a bunch of pieces as well. So that offensive line looks a little shaky. But I think this team can be carried by a guy like Geno and DK and JSN and your two stud running backs who are going to play next to Geno Smith. And if this defense can be good, I think that opens up a lot of things for Seattle. So with that said, I'm going to play it a little bit conservative now, but don't be shocked if Seattle comes in there and whoops some teams' asses come regular season time. Next up at number 16 is going to be the Indianapolis Colts. As I talked about earlier, I think this team is going to be in contention for the AFC South. I think it will start off a little bit slow. Like, I think through the first 8 games, they'll be like 4-4, maybe 5-3. But I think as the year goes on, assuming they can stay healthy, which is a big assumption I'm going to be making, I think this team could probably be upwards of like 10, 11, 12 wins next year. Now, I'm not going to be overly optimistic, so I'll say probably, realistically speaking, 11 wins, 10 wins is probably where they will get, but it all depends on the development of Anthony Richardson and, of course, the health of Anthony Richardson. I think Shane Steichen's offense will be successful no matter who's at quarterback, but if you were to put a guy like Joe Flacco in as quarterback for Shane Steichen's system, it's not going to be as good as if you had somebody like Anthony Richardson, who is like the prototypical build for a Shane Steichen system. So if Anthony can stay healthy, I think that team is going to be really good next year, assuming that everything else pans out. I think defensively speaking, they're a little bit more suspect because they give up so much big plays, but I think that they can improve off of what they did last year. And I think as long as the defense can be like middle of the road next year, I do believe that the team in general can be really good next year. But at number 15, I have the Atlanta Falcons. I talked about them a little bit earlier when I was discussing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but I do think the Falcons are the best team in that division. It's funny how the conversation has shifted on the Atlanta Falcons the past couple months, because prior to them going out there and taking Kirk Cousins, everyone was saying that this was a team that was a quarterback away from being like Super Bowl contenders. And then they get the quarterback and draft Michael Penix, and all of a sudden it's like this team might miss the playoffs, which I think is a really ridiculous take to have. Because offensively speaking, you have everything that you really need to have a good offense. You have some good running backs, a great offensive line, some good weapons like Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Darnell Mooney. I don't really know what more you would want in your weapons for your quarterback. And then defensively, yes, you had some question marks prior to the moves of Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons, but even prior to those moves, I still felt like the defense was very underrated. Now you bring in Matthew Judon and you bring in Justin Simmons, and now you're talking about a defense that can be like top 15, maybe top 10. I didn't include them in my top 10 defense video, but maybe they could be in that conversation with their new key pieces, plus their new head coach. But at the same time, we are talking about a team that has a quarterback who's coming off a torn Achilles, is a bit older, and it's just kind of hard to assume that Kirk Cousins will be able to come back and play like he did back when he was, with Minnesota. But if we assume that he can play at a similar level, I think this team is easily the best team in that division, and I really don't think it's all that close. I do feel as if this team has a bit of a limited ceiling. Like, I don't believe they're going to be a 13-14 win team that's going to be able to make it to a Super Bowl, but I think they could probably get to around 10 plus wins and make the playoffs and win the division. I really do feel as if that's a really safe thing to say. But again, I just think the conversation with the Atlanta Falcons and where they're going to go has just been a really bizarre thing that we have been doing the past couple weeks and months as we've been preparing for this upcoming season. Moving on to number 14, let's discuss the Miami Dolphins. Now, I think this offense is going to be really good as it has been the past couple years, but I think it's going to take a slight step back. Not because I think that the system's going to get worse or Tua's going to get worse, but the offensive line is very questionable, which could potentially put a lot more pressure on the shoulders of Tua Tagovailoa. And to be honest with you, I really don't feel that he's going to be able to live up to the more pressure that's going to be put on his shoulders. I really do think that Tua is a good quarterback, but he's a good quarterback in the system of Mike McDaniel. I don't think he's a good quarterback out of the system. When you ask him to make a play by himself, I don't think he can do that, and that's a huge issue for this team. But with the issues that I think this team has offensively, maybe the defense could pick it up. I do believe this is going to be a Dolphins team that's going to be really good throughout the majority of the season. But can they find the consistency the entire year and put it all together and have a successful playoff run? I don't know, and because of that, I'm going to have to put them outside of my top 10. I still do believe that the offense will be great though. But at number 13, we're going to be talking about the Dallas Cowboys. I think as long as you have Dak, Micah, and CD healthy the entire year, you're talking about a team that is almost a lock to make the playoffs. I say almost because they did lose a lot of pieces in the offseason, but I'm really not that worried about those losses. You lost Tyler Biadasz, you lost Dorrance Armstrong, you lost Tony Pollard, and yeah, those are good players, but they found a way to replace most of those guys, so I'm really not that worried. I believe that their draft class was spectacular. Guyton's looked great, Cooper Beebe's looked fantastic, and Marshawn Kneeland has actually looked quite impressive as well. So assuming that those guys play at a relatively okay level this year, I don't see a world where the Dallas Cowboys were to miss the playoffs. They really have a good roster. It's a Super Bowl caliber roster, but with Mike McCarthy as their head coach, they obviously have a bit of a lower ceiling than a lot of the other teams in front of them in this list. They're probably going to make the playoffs, but when it comes down to playoff success, I don't really know what I'm getting from this Cowboys team, which is going to be a consistent issue until the actual playoffs come around. And maybe they can change the script on what we've been talking about the entire offseason. But now let's enter into the top 12. Let's start off with 12, the LA Rams. Now, I know what you guys are saying. Well, Metro, the Dallas Cowboys smoked the shit out of the Rams last year in the regular season. That was a long time ago, and that was a Rams team that was not clicking like they were at the end of last year. I know the Cowboys could arguably be a better team, but if we're asking which team do I think has a better chance of having a deeper playoff run, I'm probably hedging my money on the LA Rams. And that's for a number of reasons. Number one, I think they have the better head coach. And number two, I think they are a damn good team that's just as good as the Cowboys. Now, I think it's pretty clear and obvious that Dallas has the better defense and arguably the better offense, but I think one team is arguably way better coached and has, in my opinion, a quarterback that doesn't fold under the pressure consistently, even though I think that's a drawn-out narrative about Dak Prescott. There is a little bit of some merit to it, so, you know, let's accept it. But with Stafford, Puka, Kyren Williams, Cooper Kupp, a good offensive line, and a defense that I think is young but has a lot of potential to be really good, you're talking about a team that could easily be in the top 10, but for the sake of the video, I'm going to have them just outside of it for right now. Similar to like a team like the Colts, I could see a world where potentially the Rams start off a little bit slow, but I think as the year goes on, they'll find their footing and win like 11, 12, or 13 games next year, assuming they can stay healthy. But next up, let's talk about number 11, the Buffalo Bills. I love a lot of things about this Bills team, but I think it's pretty obvious and clear that this team is maybe a smidge worse than they were last year. With that said, they're still a playoff contender and likely will make the playoffs simply because Josh Allen is freaking awesome, and I think the defense is still really solid. So because of that, I have a hard time putting them outside of my top 10, but because I have a lot of question marks about this team, I gotta put them outside the top 10 just by one spot, so don't kill me about it. My opinion on the Bills is this: as long as you have Josh Allen, and as long as you have a couple of decent receiving threats for him to give the ball to, and as long as your defense isn't absolutely trash, you're going to be in the playoff conversations just simply off of the back of how good Josh Allen is. And because I think that the Bills have all of those qualities, it's a really fair assumption for me to make that I think this team is going to be a good team next year. I just have a lot of questions about whether or not this team can make it to a Super Bowl run. So we'll have to wait and see. But for now, they're going to be at number 11. But all right, we have now officially hopped into the top 10. And for this top 10, I'm going to try to pick up the speed a little bit on these ones so I don't have to keep you guys for that much longer. I've talked about a lot of these teams in extensive detail throughout the season, so if you guys want more extensive detail on the teams, you can check them out for whatever team you want to check them out for. I have a whole catalog of videos throughout the offseason you can check out. But at number 10, I have the New York Jets. The key synopsis to take away for the Jets is a healthy Aaron Rodgers means that you're going to have a good offense. And with this defense being at the level that they are, in my opinion, being the best defense in the league, this team has a ceiling that could be absolutely fantastic. Again, it all depends on how good Aaron Rodgers performs and if he can stay healthy. And because I believe in A-Rod, I think this team has a ceiling that is better than any of the teams I talked about before. At number 9 is Cleveland. Now, Cleveland's tough because I don't think they have a Super Bowl caliber quarterback, but I think they have a Super Bowl caliber team. So it kind of puts me in an absolutely tough spot because I believe in their coaches and I believe in their team. I just don't know how I feel about Deshaun Watson. So because of that, I can't move them anywhere higher than number 9, but I still think this team is going to be damn good and super competitive come playoff time. It's just a big question mark about Deshaun Watson. And if Watson can be that Watson we know, this team can be great. But if it doesn't get to that spot, I don't really know what this team is going to be outside of like a borderline top 10 team. So for now, I'm hedging my bet that Watson is going to be okay next year, which puts them at number 9. At number 8, I have the Green Bay Packers. For me, I think this team has gotten significantly better in the offseason. You brought in Josh Jacobs, you brought in Xavier McKinney, you shored up your offensive line in some ways, and I do expect Jordan Love to take a massive step forward next year. So because of that, I think they're easily a top 10 team. Obviously, they smoked the Cowboys in the playoffs last year and had a very fun and competitive game with the San Francisco 49ers in the second round of the playoffs. And I expect something quite similar to what happened last year. I don't think this team will make it to a Super Bowl, but I do think that they have the team and the coaching staff to get there. So because of that, I'm going to move them in front of Cleveland. I think the Cleveland Browns have a better roster, but I believe in Love a ton more than Watson, and I think the coaching staff can will a worser roster, and I say worser as if they're a bad roster, but they're still a good roster, but worser roster than the Browns is what I'm talking about, into significant status into being a top 8 team, at least in my list. At number 7 is the Houston Texans, and this one is very similar to Buffalo. Whenever you have a quarterback like CJ Stroud, your ceiling is absolutely unlimited. He is legitimately a quarterback that should be taken seriously by everyone. He is damn good. And you surround this young player with so much more talent like they did in this offseason. And I just don't see a world where this team doesn't take a massive step forward to being a really good team. Defensively speaking, you were a good defense last year, and I expect you to be arguably a top 10 defense this year. And because your offense is as good as it is, I don't see a world where this team makes it outside of the top 10 at any point this year. At number 6 is the Philadelphia Eagles. I've talked about them in so much detail about all of my concerns and all of my praises throughout the offseason, but I'll kind of sum it up for you guys here. I think you can make the case that this is the best roster in the NFL. I don't think it is, but I think it's damn close. It's like a top 5 roster in the league. I think Hurts is a great quarterback. I think defensively they have a lot of good pieces. The only drawback I have on this team is that I think their linebackers are trash, and I have a lot of question marks about both of their coordinators. But assuming the best, this is a top 5 team. But assuming the worst, they're like top 10-ish, which is where I kind of have them kind of in the middle of both. At number 5 is the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, we will see what goes on with this Ja'Marr Chase situation because this one is becoming more interesting every single day. But if we do assume that Ja'Marr Chase comes in and plays at a high level, which I do expect him to do, then this is going to be a team that can be really good next year. And the key for this team is just going to be staying healthy, assuming that this team can stay healthy and assuming that they play at a high level throughout the year, which I think are two things that I can make very high assumptions on. Then I don't believe that this team could be anything worse than like a top 5 to top 10 team. This was a team that obviously made it to a Super Bowl, and I expect that if they're able to stay healthy, they'll be in those conversations for the rest of the season. But now we enter into the top 4. At number 4 is going to be the San Francisco 49ers. They just figured out the Brandon Ayuk situation, which, hallelujah, that was such a bizarre situation the entire offseason. But now you're essentially running the exact same team, plus a couple of other pieces and additions. So I think this team is going to be just as good, if not slightly better than they were last year. But the only reason why I have them anything lower than like number 2 is simply because I think the rest of the NFL has just gotten better. And I think San Francisco has remained essentially the same. With that said, they're easily Super Bowl contenders, and I could see a world where they'll make it to the Super Bowl yet again. At number 3 is the Baltimore Ravens. I know you lost your defensive coordinator, you lost Geno Stone, you lost Patrick Queen, and you lost Odell Beckham offensively, but to be honest with you, I really don't care. They made a bunch of other replacement moves. They brought in Zach Orr to be their defensive coordinator. I think the only loss that actually does suck is the Patrick Queen one, but they will find a way to replace him, and I think this team is still going to be super awesome. You brought in Derrick Henry to add another person on that offense that takes some reps away from Lamar Jackson, which I think is going to be awesome for this offense. And if we assume that Derrick Henry plays like the Derrick Henry we know, it's going to be an awesome team that's going to have a top 5 offense and a top 5 defense. And because of that, I have to put them at number 3. This is a team that's going to be damn competitive with basically everyone out there. Number 2 is the Detroit Lions. This is the team that I think is going to be the toughest team in the NFC. They got everything you want. They shored up their defense. They added some corners. They added some depth to the defensive line. Offensively, you're running back essentially the same team, plus a couple of key additions on the offensive line to shore up that unit. If we assume progression in Jahmyr Gibbs, Sam Laporta, Jameson Williams, and even Amon-Ra to some extent, then we're talking about a team that has so much potential to be absolutely dynamic and great next year. And because I think a lot of those progressions are really easy to predict, then I don't see a world where Detroit is not the second or best team in the NFC and a team that could easily make it to the Super Bowl. Now, the one question mark is going to be on Jared Goff. Can he be the guy that takes this team to a Super Bowl? And at this point, we've seen him in the Super Bowl. He took that team to an NFC conference game last year. I don't really think that's much of a criticism. I think he's a dang good quarterback. But of course, number one, the Kansas City Chiefs. They will likely be my number one team throughout the entire year, even if they are having like a rough start to the year, just simply because you have to put the respect on the back-to-back defending champions. I think they have a great chance to three-peat this year. They have everything and more of what you would want on a team. You have a fantastic quarterback, some solid weapons, a good offensive line, a fantastic defense. You lost L'Jarius Sneed, but you're going to be fine. This team's just loaded with talent. It's absolutely unfair to have as good of a quarterback of Patrick Mahomes while also having this good of a team. It is quite literally the perfect team, and they're going to be my number one. But of course, if you guys disagree or agree with any of the picks that I made, let me know in the comment section below and I'll make sure to respond. But if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.